Good afternoon. I would like to call to order North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board meeting. To take this opportunity to welcome all of you here. I think this is our second meeting of meeting in person again. I'm delighted to see all of you. I hope all is well with your families, and we're delighted to have you with us this afternoon. Let me begin by reading the ethics statement. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it is the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. And if any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict, with respect to any matter coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that particular point in time. We're passing around a sign-in sheet, so we're going to keep passing that to make sure that you sign in and that your presence be known. Today we have a very full agenda, and we'll get to hear from the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, the Division of Water Infrastructure, and our very own board member, Ms. Sherry White-Williamson. First, though, I'm excited and pleased to welcome Secretary Beiser. Madam Secretary, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Johnson, and good afternoon. It's so nice to see all of you here in person again for our second in-person meeting. I know there's a lot of important topics on the agenda today, but I did want to briefly start by thinking back to our last meeting together about economic development. We were really talking about how does economic development intersect with environmental justice. And I know that there's some discussion time built in later this afternoon about this issue, but I did want to just start by saying I wanted to confirm that DEQ is committed to continuing that dialogue and ensuring that environmental justice and equity issues are heard and raised at all levels. And it's especially important now given this strong economic climate. So you may have seen a few weeks ago that CNBC named North Carolina the best state in the country to do business. That's exciting news, and it gives us opportunities to make strategic and equitable investments and to make sure that we're pursuing responsible growth that benefits all residents throughout our state. So we want to uphold our values and our commitment to public health and the environment as we support our growing economy, because those two things go hand in hand. So that's why I'm grateful for Governor Cooper's commitment and leadership to prioritize environmental justice and equity, and to make sure that environmental concerns and equity issues are raised throughout the process. I'm also grateful for the partnership between DEQ and Commerce and EDP&C, and we got to hear from our colleagues over there last meeting. We are continuing to work on DEQ's end to develop resources for stakeholders, and we are strongly encouraging community engagement and input on the front end, because we know that early engagement and dialogue leads to less issues down the road. The second thing I wanted to briefly touch on is the incredible amount of state and federal funding that's available to invest in our communities for water and wastewater infrastructure. North Carolina is especially fortunate and well positioned with the federal funding. Not only did I find out when I was with my colleagues a couple of weeks ago that our state received more funding than any other state in the country for water and wastewater funding through the ARPA dollars. And in fact, we received over $1 billion more than the next closest state. We're also handling the money much more expeditiously and also with equity in the front of our minds. So the governor signed the 2022 budget this year on a Monday, and that budget contained an additional $611 million for water and wastewater infrastructure. By that Thursday, we had already awarded 96% of the unearmarked funds from that budget. In total, we awarded $789.4 million in water and wastewater infrastructure for 385 projects throughout the state. That is incredible, and that is a historic level of support for our water and wastewater infrastructure. Shadi Eskoff, who is our Division of Water Infrastructure Director, will be going into more detail on this later in the agenda. But I did want to take a minute to share something that I'm particularly proud of our team and our partners for doing. So as you all know, DEQ did targeted outreach and expanded our definition of at-risk to prioritize underserved communities in addition to at-risk systems. And because of those changes, we were able to fund 5 projects that are going to connect homes that have never been connected before to public water supply. There'll be over 800 residences that will have access to clean water and public water services for the first time ever. That is amazing, and that's just in one funding round. We know that there's even more money coming down the pipeline, which means that there's more funding that will soon be available to invest throughout the state. We've learned from our outreach to underserved communities in this first round, and we're looking for ways to continue to make investments and continue to make our process better to make sure that those dollars are being invested wisely. And there's more good news. So just last week, I believe it was last week, EPA and USDA announced a new pilot program that's going to help North Carolina communities. This pilot program will provide technical assistance to rural underserved areas with identified wastewater infrastructure needs and help them identify and access federal resources to improve public health and to build capacity. 11 towns throughout the country were chosen for this pilot, and 2 of them, I'm proud to say, are in North Carolina. One is in Halifax County and one is in Duplin County. DEQ is proud to support that effort and to assist those 2 communities and all the communities in the state who need it most. Of course, there's a lot more work to be done, always is. We've made changes to priority rating system to be more inclusive and understanding of the needs that underserved communities face. The new rating system will be in effect this fall. And we've also held back some funding from the spring funding round to allow small communities and rural communities more time to prepare applications and be able to take advantage of the historic amount of resources that we have available. You know, we have a real opportunity to make a significant difference with this investment. And DEQ is working very diligently and hard to make sure that we're investing those funds in a strategic and equitable way. I do want to take a moment to publicly thank Shadi and his team at the Division of Water Infrastructure for the incredible work that they have done to get these dollars out the door and prioritizing equity like they did, and continuing to make that a priority as we enter into future funding rounds. And lastly, before I turn it back over to you, Chairman Johnson, I do want to take a moment to recognize that this year is the 40th anniversary of the PCB protest in Warren County that sparked the rise of the environmental justice movement. And this advisory board is a great example of the impacts of those efforts in Warren County 40 years ago. As far as I know, this is the first board created at the state level in North Carolina with the express purpose of ensuring underserved and vulnerable communities that they have a voice in the decision-making process. So hearing your perspectives and those of the communities that we all serve is so important to the work here at DEQ, and it makes us a better agency. Know that I appreciate the time and effort that you spend with this board. I appreciate and value your input. And together, I know that we will continue to honor the legacy of the work that began here in North Carolina. So thank you for this time, Dr. Johnson, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Secretary Advisor. We're grateful to you for taking time from your busy schedule to share with us this afternoon. Next up, we have Mr. Cesar Castro, the Chief Policy and Planning Officer from the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, to share with us. Mr. Castro, welcome. The floor is yours.
Is the presentation going to be up? Do I put the presentation up? Yeah. Thank you. All right. Greetings, everyone. My name is Cesar Castro. I'm the new Chief of Policy and Planning Officer for ENCOR. I'm glad to be here today and talking to y'all. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge, I know that folks are on the line as well, that some of the folks in this board, in this room, might be survivors of a hurricane and who have witnessed firsthand the devastation and the long-term challenges that are presented by the recovery process. We at ENCOR understand that often these same communities experience hurricanes over and over again. and are often the ones that also experience the slow disasters of poverty and environmental injustices. So we recognize that and want to acknowledge that before we begin. As an office, we try to take a long-term proactive approach to recovery, a recovery that doesn't just put things back together, but looks into the future to mitigate those hazards and mitigate those risks in the long term for those communities. Our staff works day in, day out with applicants, the programs we manage and administer. And our goal is to improve the experiences of hurricane survivors, disaster survivors, and to respond and to act on the feedback from these kinds of bodies, the public, elected officials, federal and state partners. So we were asked today to present on some of the ways we approach environmental justice and equity, the way it's woven into our daily work. So we're very grateful for that opportunity and very thankful for the chance to hear any thoughts and any feedback you may have. Can I go to the next slide? Or wait, click here. Oh. Thank you. So just a little bit of the agenda for today. I'm going to do a little bit of introductions as to what NCORE does or who we are, a little bit of the framework surrounding our work, which is predicated on HUD funding, a little bit of the approach of equity, how we approach equity from a perspective of fair housing, a couple of executive orders that we must adhere to, our action planning and our citizen participation. And then I'll touch a little bit on the environmental justice approach, how we do that via environmental reviews, also through our programming. Our strategic buyout program is a good example, and a few new strategies and initiatives that have been put on the table for us to think about, such as Justice Voting, that's been put forward by the Biden administration, and also our ongoing staff training. And then I'm hoping to, folks have questions to open that up. So a little bit about NCORE, just to ground set us. NCORE was established in 2019 by Governor Roy Cooper as a way to streamline the recovery process statewide and to help communities rebuild smarter and stronger. The office at the moment administers about $1 billion in CDBG and CDBG mitigation funds. So it's an alphabet soup, but these are all funding sources from HUD. And overall, we're a part of a division of the Department of Public Safety, I should add. We manage several programs that support long-term disaster recovery, resiliency, homeowner recovery infrastructure, affordable housing, some strategic buyout programming, and some local grants to government agencies and some other institutions. We also partner with a lot of our state institutions just to provide some strategic support to provide services to communities across North Carolina. One of those, next slide. One of those partnerships is actually with the North Carolina Resilient Communities Program, which is composed of two elements. One is the RISE program, which NCORE administers, and then the other one is the Resilient Coastal Communities Program, which is led by DEQ's Division of Coastal Management. Together, these programs support local communities by providing expertise, technical support, and funding to implement some mitigation measures and some long-term resiliency.
So just so you know, they're controlling in the back.
Oh.
There's about a 5-second delay, which is why it's taking a little long.
Yeah, okay.
So sorry about that.
No worries. This is a new world when you come back into in-person meetings with
Yes.
technology. Apologies for those online. So a little bit of the framework around what where our funding comes from at NCORE. So as I mentioned, much of our recovery efforts are funded by CDBG and CDBG mitigation funding from HUD. Just to add a little bit of context about what this means. So whenever the president declares a major disaster, Congress may appropriate a set of funds to HUD when there are significant unmet needs for long-term recovery. These unmet needs are needs that are not covered by other sources and can be covered only possibly by CDBG-DR, for example. The special appropriation is very specific. What we can do with that funding, we can do disaster relief, long-term recovery, restoration and infrastructure, housing, and some economic development. By design, CDBG-DR and CDBG mitigation funding supplements other federal funding and is meant to be we come at the end of all the other resources that have come in, such as when after FEMA comes into a community, for example, just to add a little bit of context. So a little bit about our approach to equity. As an office, ENCOR prioritizes and preserves equity in the distribution and administration of funds by focusing on its recovery efforts on low to moderate income communities and vulnerable populations. For ENCOR, an equitable approach to disaster recovery requires identifying federally protected populations in impacted areas and removing barriers to accessing recovery assistance. So for example, to ensure equitable access, regardless of national origin, all materials that we produce for our programs and on our website must be translated for limited English proficiency populations. Funds must also be distributed in a manner that preserves equity and reaches all impacted groups. So for example, we have a call center, or we might be able to meet with folks in person in pre-COVID days. That's sort of our work to provide some equitable access to those funds. In the day-to-day, this is also manifested in sort of our regulatory obligations. A key one here for us is fair housing and civil rights. So as a HUD grantee, ENCOR is required to manage and distribute the funds we receive in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing goals and protects civil rights. In essence, all of our funding must adhere and comply with the Civil Rights Act, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Housing and Community Development Act, and along other statutory regulatory obligations that we must make to make sure that our funding is equitable and our approaches are equitable. Next slide. One of these frameworks, for example, is the Executive Order 12898, which directs all federal agencies to identify and address disproportionate impacts on minority and low-income populations and develop strategies to implement environmental justice. So this is part of our own framework when we deliver programming. Another piece of the puzzle for us in our equitable approach is related to serving limited English proficiency populations. From a statutory perspective, we must adhere to the Civil Rights Act. And also make sure that we provide reasonable steps and meaningful access to programs for limited English populations across the state and in areas we serve, I should say. So ENCOR posts our materials in Spanish regularly, for example, and we have a language access plan on our website that kind of gives our framework around those issues. The map on the right, for example, we recently put out an action plan on related to Haywood County, Tropical Storm Fred. It shows where we believe limited English proficiency populations are. And so this helps us strategize in ways to approach those community members that might have been impacted by the storm. Another key component of what we do to ensure equitable approach to our programming is via our action plans. And this is a key component of what I do every day at ENCOR. So for ENCOR, we must develop an action plan that specific to the disaster and the recovery effort, which entails how we're going to do the programming. We have to explore ways that the activities that we're proposing, how they might impact protected classes, vulnerable populations, and underserved communities. We must be very meaningful. We have a meaningful approach to those discussions. There's also a particular focus on how the programming must address the unmet needs of low-income and moderate-income households and the vulnerable populations in the way we serve and we provide the funding. So all those are really addressed in our action plans. Another key component to equity for ENCOR is our citizen participation. We must ensure as ENCOR that citizens are able to provide meaningful feedback throughout our process. So we do this via many functions. So we have the State Disaster Recovery Task Force that we're part of, which provides local partners the opportunity to chime in on some of the work. We're also leading regional resilience plans, which are created by stakeholder partnerships and feedback. The action plans already mentioned have a regulatory public comment period. So Tropical Storm Fred right now, that action plan has a 30-day period that ends at the end of the month. So folks want to comment on that particular action plan, please do. And we must also affirmatively market our programming and the way people can participate in the program and in the action plans and everything we're doing as an agency. Great. So let's dive in a little bit more about how we approach environmental justice. As NCORE, addressing climate and environmental justice is critical to what we do every day. So to us, this means making sure that we're creating resilient and inclusive communities in North Carolina that can rebound, adapt, and thrive amid challenging conditions and challenges. At its core, environmental justice to NCORE means ensuring equal protection from environmental and health hazards, and providing equal, meaningful opportunities to participate in the decision-making process, again, to achieve a healthier environment for all North Carolinians. That's our overall approach. In practice, we do this through our environmental review process, for example. So every program, every activity we undertake must go through the environmental assessment process. This includes a review of a number of environmental factors, such as environmental justice and other important key elements to our environmental impact to the activities we're undertaking. In our programming, we also attempt to live up to our approach, such as our strategic buyout program is a good example. So strategic buyout program is 100% voluntary program. There must be one must establish a particular zone where we're going to be doing these sort of strategic buyouts, and in those zones, we have to identify predictable environmental threats to members of protected classes, vulnerable populations, and underserved communities. So the team at NCORE, the strategic buyout team, works across communities impacted by Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence to understand those local threats, those community needs, the history of those communities, and to share information and resources about the program. And we've done so in many communities, including Princeville and others across the state. So that's part of our commitment to environmental justice. As I mentioned, there are new initiatives out there that we must also take into account in our work, such as Justice 40, which is a new initiative by the Biden administration, which intends to help 40% provide 40% of the benefits of the investments made in federal funding towards climate change by building green infrastructure, affordable housing, affordable and sustainable housing, clean water initiatives, and other relative initiatives. HUD is part of that goal of Justice 40, so it's fairly new for HUD. And there's a scorecard that some of you might be involved in drafting and crafting for this particular initiative that as those are being developed, NCORE will have to also adhere to and follow. And lastly, as an agency and as an organization, we realize that we cannot always keep up with everything we need to know everywhere, right? And so we may not always have the right answer. And so we are committed to ongoing staff training on equity, long-term mental health, for example, long-term mental health, resiliency, and some environmental justice as an ongoing priority for the organization. So recently we have engaged our case managers on groundwater approach, the groundwater approach, and training them on that particular approach. We've also solicited the help of Dr. Lonnie Crum from ECU, who has provided some very interesting work, interesting insights into disaster recovery, particularly that long-term mental health resilience that it takes. And this is all to equip our staff to be more, frankly, more empathetic to the work we're attempting to do. So that's all I have for you all today. I really appreciate your time. I left my contact information in case you have questions, and obviously if you want to reach out, please do, and there's also the website.
Castro, thank you very much. Do we have questions?
I do.
Wait.
Mr. Castro, thank you for your presentation. I have had the opportunity over the last couple of months to actually speak with a number of people who were supposed to have homes rebuilt or replaced, who are still living in hotels or less than favorable conditions. What is ENCOR doing to address these concerns?
That's a great question. Over the last few years, we understand that folks have had a hard time, accessing the assistance we have provided. And I'm fairly new to the organization myself, but I know that moving forward, what we have addressed is there's policy questions we have done, there are policy changes we have implemented, there are operational changes we're implementing to make sure that those particular hurdles are overcome in the long term. But we also understand that the hurdles those families or households might be experiencing may not go away right away. So we're slowly building our infrastructure, our means to rapidly address the shortcomings or any shortcomings we might have had previously.
Are you doing any outreach directly to them so that they know what you're doing?
Yes, there's some of that one-on-one in terms of particular applications, particular applicants in our system. So our case managers and our staff are in constant communication to make sure that is. We're having the line of communication. I should add that often, by the time we get to these, as I mentioned, CDBG-DR is the last funding source that comes to disaster recovery. So these cases are often complex, and so they take longer to unravel. And so we are constantly in communication with the households we attempt to serve, for them to understand the process and for them to understand our parameters and what we are capable of doing and not do it in some cases. Often, we can't help what's going on outside the organization. I read today, for example, that windows and doors have quite a backlog, or even getting those into our facility, into our homes in order to rebuild or reconstruct them. So things of those elements are tough for us, and we try to be as communicate those particular parameters as much as we can.
Thank you.
Okay.
So this is from Veronica Carter. She's a member who is participating online, but we're having some technological issues. But she has asked, while this program helps homeowners, there are renters, particularly in public housing in Wilmington, who are still not housed due to Hurricane Florence. What are we doing for renters?
That's a great question. In our action plans, we attempt to address sort of what these unmet needs are, and we're constantly trying to address what we have made, any unmet needs in those communities. So I know I can't speak for Wilmington per se, but I know for our new action plan for Tropical Storm Fred, that's one of the key elements we're trying to address is the shortcomings of renters in those particular impacted communities. And so I know that as we look forward to implementing or changing our programming in any way, we're attempting to communicate with those communities to understand how we may be able to address those needs. But it's not as easy as flipping a switch and being able to execute and move forward on those. But comments like this helps us to understand what those unmet needs might be and how we can move forward in addressing them through our own funding. Yeah.
On your limited English proficiency program, I noticed that you have made it available, all the information for them, that it is on the web. And many of the people that I know I've talked to who live in areas that don't have, they have limited computer service.
Yeah.
Is there any effort to make efforts with these people, again, face to face, rather than asking them to go on a computer?
Indeed, COVID kind of paused some of that work, right? But we've been attempting to do other forms of outreach. So particularly for the Spanish community, radio is important often as well. And so at least in Hayward County, we've been able to partner with a local outlet that's providing Spanish language broadcasts that presents the information we're attempting to broadcast to those communities. They actually also do it in some Mayan languages, which is very intriguing to me. But that's one way we can mitigate sort of the shortcomings that COVID has given us in terms of face-to-face interactions. Prior to COVID, we did have some rebuild centers that provided some of that face-to-face interaction. But as we look forward to re-engaging those community partners, we're hoping to be out there more and having those conversations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cesar, for that wonderful presentation. So as we're talking about our limited English proficiency community or our English language learners, when you're going out and having staff members connect with the community groups, how has it been with your bandwidth and staff? Are you able to get staff that go to the community that speak these languages, or is there a training process for folks that don't speak the language but to be able to communicate? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. For Inquiry often looks like partnering with local organizations, relying on counties, relying on municipalities to really give us the leg up. We understand we're a statewide organization, so we're not going to have all the infrastructure ready, and so it's often relying on those resources and those partnerships to provide that access, if at all possible. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Mr. Castro, are extreme heat events considered disasters in your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, not at the moment. So our funding is predicated on a presidentially declared disaster, right? So a hurricane, a major, and there hasn't been one of those in North Carolina, like heat related, yet. That is not to say that it may not be one. Another source for us to think about is, a long-term mitigation of other hazards. So as we identify those hazards, to find the resources to, at least plan for those. So a specific hazard as heat is not in our arsenal yet, but we're constantly looking at those impacts. And I know that as much as impacts those communities we're already serving in this hurricane recovery efforts, we want to make sure that when we rebuild for those communities that we take into account, for example, heat, and that in the construction of these homes that they're energy efficient, they are up to those standards so that at least cooling and heating can be affordable, if any. Yeah.
One last question. Is there any consideration of equity in your disaster recovery supply chains? And the reason I'm asking the question is I was in Florida recently, and a person came to repair something in my house, and he said, I'm just back from North Carolina. I'm part of the disaster supply chain in North Carolina. And I'm wondering how, if any consideration in the people who do the work of recovery is that we're focused on creating and supporting existing homegrown businesses to do that work on the supply side.
Yeah, I don't think I can speak directly about the supply side of the work, but I can get back to you and see if I can find some more additional information on specifically the supply chain. We do attempt to harvest and make sure that our the businesses and contractors we interact with have those opportunities, right? And
do we know anything about what percentage of the dollars that we spend in disaster recovery go to historically underutilized businesses?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head today, unfortunately, but I can certainly provide that information to y'all as needed. I would say that as part of a HUD grantee, elements such as those, so making sure that HUD language is, we adhere to Section 3 and to some other elements of regulatory obligations that we are making those commitments to our community members. We are accountable in that sense as well. So, but I don't have those metrics off the top of my head, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions from Mr. Castro? Yes,
So I see that you value, thank you for your presentation. I see that you value citizen participation. What does the feedback loop look like for impacted communities to provide feedback on processes? And how do you take that to actually change change processes for the future?
That's a great question. the formal mechanism is through these action plans I mentioned,
Okay.
and the public comment that goes along with these action plans. So every time we change eligibility or we shift funding from one program to another, if that was to occur, when we make any programmatic changes, we must do an action plan. And in those action plans and during this 30-day comment period, that is one of the best ways community members can provide feedback. And that is when we can address some of the shortcomings in the policies or the programming we're attempting to make. But even in between those action plans, there should be, and we attempt to have the conversation with local communities that we're serving, the local counties, the local governments, to get that sense of how the work is impacting those residents and homeowners and whoever we're attempting to serve. But the action plans are truly when the formal mechanism to do so.
I have one last question, and that goes to the question that Ms. Marsh Robinson asked. You said there's a 30-day comment period. I come from one of those impacted communities. 30 days is not enough. Has your agency ever considered making it 60 or a longer period of time?
I'm not sure if we have considered it, but it's feasible and possible. That is not within reason for us to consider that. And that's great feedback to hear that 30 days may not be enough.
We're talking about communities, as Mr. Velasquez said, oftentimes have lack of access to broadband. And by the time you get that information to folks, that 30-day period is often over.
Yeah. It's a very fair assessment. Yeah. And thank you for noting that, and I'll take a note of that as well. Yeah.
Mr. Castro, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Okay. Our next agenda item is to hear an update on funding allocations from the Division of Water Infrastructure Director, Mr. Shadi Eskoff. Thank you for joining us today, Director. We appreciate you being here and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the board members for having me here to give an update on water and sewer funding for the spring round, as well as going forward as well. I'd also like to thank Secretary Beiser for her opening remarks. I think she basically covered my presentation in the opening remarks, but we can go into a little bit more details as well.
We're kind of slow, so hearing it twice won't hurt.
So I'll give an update on where things, I think I've presented twice so far to the boards. Last presentation was in February. We were in the beginning of the application process for the spring round of funding. We've since had the application round completed. So I'll give you an update on where things, how that went and where we're going forward as well, to give you some additional updates there. So the spring round of funding, we do 2 rounds of funding for water and wastewater every year. Spring round ended, application were due May 2nd. And this round of funding was focused on water and wastewater specifically. Stormwater really comes in this next fall round. But between February and April, we announced the ARPA administration plan, which explained how we would administer $1.69 billion worth of ARPA funding for water, wastewater, and stormwater. And we announced it. We opened up the application process. The administration plan specifically addressed providing funding specifically to connect residences in disadvantaged, underserved areas to water, wastewater systems. We explained how that would be assessed, what the applicants would need to show in their applications in order to be able to apply for that funding. Those type of projects were open to all water, wastewater utilities across the state, and they could apply up to $15 million worth of grant funding for that particular type of project. Now, there are a lot of other types of projects that local governments were also applying for. This is just one of those, but we focused on that, and we highlighted that in all of our outreach and all of our education because it was a new thing that we were adding to this spring round. We also added prioritization into the priority rating system for these projects to make them eligible for priority points, because the awards go to projects that score highest on this priority rating system. So we added it to the priority rating system. We actually kind of explained it in the priority rating system. And as I mentioned, we did outreach and training about the applications themselves and the funding opportunities and availability, and we always highlighted this particular funding opportunity. We presented this in several places. We do application trainings that we recommend everybody to attend before applying. We also recorded the application training. The application trainings were highly attended because there was a lot of interest in the ARPA funding. And we also presented a lot of conferences and organizations like the League of Municipalities, Association of County Commissioners, other places that local governments tend to go to. We went and presented in February and March about the funding opportunities. And as you heard from Secretary Beiser, we also did targeted outreach to 24 utilities across the state where there were known communities that have failed or failing on-site water, wastewater systems, to inform them about this funding opportunity and invite them to apply. And if they needed to know a little more about the neighborhood communities, we offered them to reach out to us. We also partnered with the School of Government's Environmental Finance Center to follow up on these communications that we initiated. Thank you. Next slide. So in the spring rounds, which ended, again, the applications were due May 2nd. We received a record number of applications in total. We had 649 applications that were received asking for $3 billion worth of funding. We didn't have $3 billion worth of funding. So the priority rating system really kicked in to kind of identify and prioritize who gets funding. Out of the 649 that came in, 11 of the applications were asking for this funding, asking for the at-risk funding to connect residences in disadvantaged, underserved areas. They came from 7 utilities across the state. 7 applications were for drinking water, 4 of them were for wastewater. And in combination, those 11 applications asked for $63.2 million. As I mentioned, the applications were all reviewed according to the priority rating system, and the projects that scored highest were awarded funds first. So we went down the funding round. In addition to the fact that we had such a high number of applications and funding requests, we also noticed that the quality of the applications in terms of the types of projects that were being presented were higher than in normal rounds. So it was even more competitive this round, not just because of the number of applications, but just the types of projects that other projects were competing against. So it was we had a lot of application reviews to go through all these. As a result of the funding rounds, well, we've awarded a lot of funds, but for these particular 11 applications, 5 of them received funding, and they're all from the drinking water side. So $29.3 million are going to 5 drinking water projects to connect residences in disadvantaged, underserved areas to the water systems in Nash County, McDowell County, Duplin, Sampson, and Edgecombe counties. The applications that are not funded, so the other 6 applications that came in were not funded because they didn't score high enough to get the funding, will be reconsidered automatically in the fall round. So that's a process that we normally have. If you apply for funding, you don't get funding, we will reconsider you. And because we've adjusted the priority system even again, we've added additional prioritization, their reconsideration will accommodate the increased prioritization for disadvantaged areas, and I'll mention that again a little bit later. We will also be reaching out to all the applicants that did not receive funding, but in particular, these communities, we will reach out to, because this is a new thing, we'll be reaching out to them to let them know how they did on their application and give them feedback in case they want to consider reapplying or just to keep their application for reconsideration. Next slide, thank you. So a little bit more about the projects that applied and those. So the yellow highlights are those that got funded. These are the 11 applications that came in. And I've got my own notes here in case you want to know about any particular community. But again, we got 11 applications in. And you can see that there's a diversity. They came from different locations across the state. And some of them that were proposing to connect up to 400 homes. Some were connecting smaller communities up to, I think the smallest one was 20 connections in Edgecombe County. Some of them had knowledge of these areas and had wanted to do this project, so they already were planning ahead before the spring round. And these were projects that the opportunity came up, so they applied. And others, like for example, Sampson County was an interesting one where a community member heard a presentation about the funding. So one of the outreach that we were talking about in February, they heard that presentation and they reached out to the county, and really it was a community-led community-led application. So they work with the county public utility director as well as the county commissioners, and they put in an application. We have helped answer questions as well. So that was a different approach than the other ones, where the other ones just knew what the projects were and they wanted to apply for those. Next slide, please. Here's an example of kind of what we asked for in the application. We try to keep it as simple as possible in the application process. We said for them to qualify for the priority points, what they would need to show is using the DEQ community mapping system, which maps the potentially underserved block groups. If they do a screenshot of that and they show where the project is, and if the project is in that area, that's all the documentation we need to know that at least it's for a disadvantaged underserved area. Now, they also have additional application forms and additional information they need to share with us, but on the qualification for disadvantaged underserved area, that was the documentation. It was a screenshot and just draw the lines to show us and to list the streets that they were on. So we, all the applications, I think, provided that kind of documentation. We also had the option for them to apply and provide a narrative. If they wanted to propose a project in a disadvantaged area, but it doesn't show up on the community mapping system as disadvantaged, underserved, they could provide a narrative to explain why that project area is disadvantaged. Maybe the metrics, maybe it's a smaller area than the block group shows that that area is disadvantaged. They can provide a narrative. None of the 11 applications provided that. All of them had an application that had this map and the lines in them. Next slide, please. So looking forward and going into the next funding rounds, between March and July, we've accomplished a few more things. One of which is that we took the opportunity to meet with the State Water Infrastructure Authority. Again, that's the boards that sets the priority rating system for the state. And we made recommendations to changes to the priority rating systems in March and April to add some, there were some additional changes as well, but we also wanted to add some more prioritization to disadvantaged areas. And I keep saying disadvantaged areas, that's the term that they kind of adopted in the end. We mean pockets of underserved areas to differentiate from disadvantaged communities, because that's a term that we use and EPA uses to talk about local governments, or it's a specific term used for who gets funding that's additionally subsidized. But to differentiate that, when we're talking about pockets of areas that are smaller than local governments, we're calling them disadvantaged areas, and they can be inside towns or outside towns as well. So we made recommendations to add prioritization for the disadvantaged areas. They've adopted those changes after going through a public review period. And that was done, I think the public review period was in June to July, May to June, and then we took the final recommendations to SWIA in July as well, and those were adopted. So the new priority rating system now is in effect. We actually have just opened the fall 2022 funding round. We're taking applications now. It'll be kind of early, it was just opened recently, but we're using that new rating system. And as I mentioned, that this new rating system will be used to reassess unfunded applications that came in the spring. So those that were not funded, we will reassess and give them points as for whatever documentation was already provided. We'll try to use that with the new rating system. Between now and September, so this fall 2022 funding rounds, applications are due at the end of September. Between now and then, we're doing a lot of trainings. Actually, we just completed our last application training yesterday. We had 6 trainings, application trainings across the states, 6 different regions across the state. Yesterday's was here, and we recorded that one as well. It was a hybrid one. We had over 100 people attend that one virtually, and there were several people in the audience too. That recording is going to be posted as well. But we reserved, as you heard from the Secretary, we've reserved some of that at-risk funding. We didn't award all the at-risk funding at once in spring. We wanted to reserve a little bit of it for this fall round to give the applicants an opportunity to revise and update their applications and have more time for other communities that didn't have time. If we were reaching out to them in March and April, letting them know about the at-risk funding, it might have been too soon for them to try to apply. So there's more opportunity for them to develop an application by the September round. And again, we will be reaching out to the spring 2022 applicants that did not get funding to let them know that they'll be reconsidered or they're welcome to resubmit their application to take advantage of the new priority rating system. And any presentations that we do to discuss the application rounds will continue to emphasize providing benefits to disadvantaged areas. I will also add, so I thought I had a point here, one of my bullet points, but the rating system adds prioritization for providing service to disadvantaged areas, just like what we used in the spring round, but we made it more explicit. And it's the second highest project purpose point. The highest project purpose point is something that SWIA decided, which is if there's a local government that has a non-viable system that just needs to be rescued and to merge that system and get it stop being a utility, that's the highest priority. The second highest priority is this along with one other, so it's a joint second highest priority. But in addition to that, we're also adding points. Oh, these are my points, thank you. We're also adding, next point please. We're also adding more points, 5 additional points, if a project benefits a disadvantaged area. So not just providing service, but any project that is benefiting a disadvantaged area, at least the majority of the benefits accrue to a disadvantaged area, they get 5 additional points as well. So it's more prioritization than we had in the spring round as well. It's not exclusive to providing service. And we've adopted similar prioritization for this new stormwater funding program. So we just created a new stormwater funding program that will be in effect. We're taking the first round of applications this fall round. And we've added similar prioritization for benefits to disadvantaged areas. Looking at what funding is available, so in addition to the ARPA at-risk funding that we still have remaining, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided additional drinking water state revolving fund and clean water state revolving fund. So more funds available to our funding programs that we typically administer in terms of loans and principal forgiveness, which is like a grant. There were basically a significant boost to the amount of funds that we have for the SRF programs. In addition with a significant increase to the amount of principal forgiveness available. So we have more grant-like funding available coming in from the bipartisan infrastructure law in the fall onwards. And we've created a process by which projects that benefit disadvantaged areas, these pockets of underserved areas, would be eligible for these additional subsidies. So we made that into the program ahead of this fall round, and we made it into it's a permanent change to our funding program. So everything I just mentioned is going forward as well, not just as a one-year thing. In addition, we also were grateful for getting our allocations back for the community development block grant infrastructure grant funding. It's always been the go-to funding for water and wastewater to serve or to benefit low and moderate income households. Our funding has gone back up to $20 million this round. We'll have $20 million to award this fall round as well. And as you heard from the secretary, we've got I think the term that is the name of the pilot program, the Closing America's Wastewater Access Gap Community Initiative. I'm not sure if there's an easy acronym to read there. But that's the pilot program that EPA and USDA are co-administering. And we're really grateful to have 2 of the 11 communities from the nation here in North Carolina participating in this, the Hollister community in Halifax County, as well as the East Log Cabin Roads, which is just outside of Peachey in Duplin County. So we'll be working directly with EPA and USDA on that. A couple more things to look forward to. We're working with the Research Triangle Environmental Health Collaborative, which is a group that puts together summits to talk about environmental policy. They're working with us to plan a summit on water funding and environmental justice coming up. So this is all kind of new. We just had 2 meetings to start planning this. Potentially, we're looking at doing the summit in January. The preliminary plans is to try to invite community members, local government officials, DEQ, and interested parties to congregate for one day to talk about providing service in disadvantaged communities, to learn from all of those groups, and to have communication between one another so that the outputs of again, this is all preliminary, but the outputs would be guidance documents to inform either the communities and or the local governments. If you're interested in providing service to disadvantaged areas, these are steps that you should take, or these are considerations you should have, as well as recommendations to DEQ about our funding programs and what we can do to facilitate this kind of funding. And I'm here to share on behalf of the planners extend an invitation to the board members or to others that you may know who may be interested. If you'd like to participate in the summit, either to attend the summit, to plan the summit, to be part of it, please let us know. They wanted me to pass on that invitation to you, so doing that now. Or please let Renee know. I think Renee could connect as well. And then we're also continuing engagement with university partners in conducting case studies and doing some research to focus on the needs of disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged areas, and funding. So we want to do some case studies. Go into some of the communities that have either applied or have not yet applied to learn from the communities and from the local governments what are the questions that are coming up about access to funding to provide service. And maybe it's not just to provide service. Maybe it's projects to benefit disadvantaged areas. So we want to go out to the communities and learn a little bit more. So we're engaging with the University of North Carolina right now to do some of those kind of case studies and to learn. And again, we see this as an ongoing process. We want to keep refining, keep improving our funding programs going to the future. So this is one way of doing that. It will take some time, but we're engaging right now. We're analyzing applications. After this fall round, because of the new priority rating system, we want to take a look and see what's come in from the applications, how many applicants came in asking for the disadvantaged areas, benefit points, how did they fare with their applications. So we'll be doing that and reporting to SWIA on the results of the impact of changes to the rating systems. And we'll continue to do outreach to utilities where possible to kind of inform the funding opportunities that are available. And also we want to take a look at the RFQs that go out to request for bids or request for qualifications to do the project work itself, to see what else we can do to encourage disadvantaged business DBE inclusion as well in those considerations. I think that covers my slides, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
The Secretary just spoke recently about the amount of funding that we received in the state, a large amount, and the amount to be spent on water. And one of the members from the board, who's an elder in the Hawaii Nation, has mentioned before how little work has been done as far as the wastewater and clean water in that area, primarily because there is a school there that they watch out for. And it was just interesting to see that it is still one of the areas that is even listed here that the Hawaii Nation is on. Is there some reason that that particular area has not been serviced for the wastewater and water? And it's been a while since he's a member of the board.
Yeah, so that community, if that's a Hollister community, I don't remember if it was Hollister specifically, but it sounds like it might be. That is one of the two communities that we're working with on the pilot program with EPA and USDA. So there's going to be direct work with DEQ and EPA and USDA in that community to get them to a point where they do apply. I don't believe that they actually applied, either Halifax County or the Hollister community itself, applied for funding the spring ground. So that is one of those questions that we are asking. We know there's a big need out there. We got 11 applications. We know there's a lot more needs than what we can see in 11 applications. So what are the obstacles? Why are communities not applying? Is it they don't know about the funding opportunities, or are they having a difficult time applying for it? And if so, we need to know what the obstacles are so we can try to break those down. But I can't speak much more about that community. They haven't, again, I don't think they've applied. Yeah, and I'm looking at the list of the 11 applications that came in, and Halifax was not one of those applications, unfortunately.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I have a question concerning your engagement with university partners.
Yes, ma'am.
in conducting case studies. And I'd like to know what does that look like as it started? What universities are engaged, and do you have students involved?
So we're
Particular students for underrepresented groups.
Thank you for that question. So we're just beginning to do that planning stage right now. I actually just left a meeting to talk about this and to try to start planning and identify which communities to even consider for case studies. We're working with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina as part of the School of Government. We've also been in discussions with the North Carolina Policy Collaboratory. That's also at least housed within UNC, but it encompasses others. We're starting off with the UNC and the Environmental Finance Center. We already have a contract with them. So that's part of that work that we already have. But we're eager to consider additional, so that's the starting point. Now, who's going to be doing the actual case studies? It will be the staff and students. And the EFC hires both. They have permanent staff as well as they have students. But I can't speak yet to who exactly will be doing the projects. And again, we're still at early preliminary stages, so we haven't identified specific. We've got some ideas of what the communities are, but we haven't finalized that list.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It seems like this intentional outreach, the extra, trainings and just the extra work that you all have done, really made a difference. And just really, it's encouraging to see, and not to imply that it hasn't been done before, but just maybe I just didn't notice, but just really, it's great to see that these communities are, getting some of the services and basic amenities that they deserve. And I just really like that a lot of these changes are being made permanent into the programs. It's not just to satisfy a moment, but it's something that's going to be permanently changed. And although I feel like this intentional outreach is something that maybe other divisions can perhaps learn from. And so I don't know if there's conversations going on within the department. And I'm not even saying with regards to grant programs, but just the difference that can be made within, and I know it takes resources, right? And I know sometimes, it takes like a mandate to come out to say that, you need to do this, or we need to see this as a criteria of the program. But just thinking about the difference that can be made in communities that have not seen this level of support and resources before, and some of the, technical advice and other things that are coming forward. I just want to continue to encourage you to keep moving forward, as it sounds like you're going to be doing, but to also share this with other division leaders within DEQ, and maybe we can talk. Maybe that's a conversation that we can have, later, to see how that could be done. I don't know, and just share it more throughout the department.
Sure.
Thank you for that comment. A quick shout out, thank you to Sharon and Kathy and Renee and Bailey and Secretary Advisor. We had a lot of meetings to talk about this. We've done great outreach. I think we can keep doing more, but coordinating with other divisions. All right, thank you.
Mr. Escar, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for all of the effort you put into this. Thank you for answering a lot of questions that I'm aware that you answered to get where we got with the community in Sampson County. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the anticipated new infrastructure bill that's going to be signed and what it will mean for North Carolina.
So that's the bipartisan infrastructure law that I mentioned. It's going to be additional funding for the state revolving fund and the additional subsidy, which is basically like a grant. And that's where by adding that prioritization for disadvantaged areas and making those projects eligible for the additional subsidies, it's going to provide more funding opportunities for projects that do benefit or serve disadvantaged areas. There'll be more opportunities to have funding with or without additional subsidy because we'll have more funding available. That funding is different than the ARPA funding, which we just went through. ARPA funding was all grants, so definitely highest amount of demand was for that. CDBG is all grants. So we have $20 million available. It's only for low and moderate income projects. But the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is, in other words, BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, provides a lot more low interest loans with additional subsidies. And I would hope, and I would expect to see more applications, especially since we're prioritizing projects in disadvantaged areas. I would like to see some more of those applications come in. But that's where we'll find out when we do the fall. We'll do outreach. We'll keep educating, keep announcing all of this. Once we go through the funding round, we'll report back to SWIA, and I'm happy to share here as well what the outcome of the application funding round was. But this is the first of 5 years of this new funding. So it will be the first time, and we'll have opportunities to keep adjusting and tweaking.
One last question, and thank you for your presentation and for the very hard work you've been doing for disadvantaged communities. North Carolina is the 4th most attractive migration destination in the country. During the first 15 months of the pandemic, we had 253 people arrive in North Carolina every day. I'm wondering if we should, in these communities that we're doing all this great work, begin to look at what happens to those communities after they get all the infrastructure. Do they become targets for gentrification and turnover because they do have all of that infrastructure and the like? I think it's something that we need to pay attention to, because a lot of these places are the new destinations for development. And it just struck me in having done the analysis recently that it might be worth, I don't know that we're far enough along in redeveloping some of these communities, but I think in terms of impact of what we're what we're doing, that might be worth one of the case studies, if you will, of understanding the unintended impacts and consequences of what we're doing. And I don't have an answer for it, but it just struck me as something to worry about a little bit, given the number of people who are arriving in North Carolina.
Thank you. Yeah, I think looking at impacts, it's high on mind, and trying to figure out how to do that is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Veronica just had a comment that many of these small communities, if they are incorporated, do not have large staff. And if they are unincorporated areas, then they are at the mercy of county staff. So there wasn't a question, it was just a comment.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Next up, we will be hearing from our very own board member, Ms. Spike Williamson, presenting on EG efforts going across the country. We had this discussion at the last meeting that there's no sense in reinventing the wheel if there were good things going on, but we needed to know more about them. I can't think of anybody better to help us with that. Ms. Sherry White, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. This is not an exhaustive list because there are a lot of things going on across the country, but I wanted to at least give a sense of that, and then we can obviously have broad conversations as we go through the rest of the year. This is my roadmap for today. I decided I wanted to talk a little bit about legislative and administrative actions that we've seen, some non-legislative and executive actions that we've seen and could be examples of things that could be done here in the state. And then finally to talk about some of the options that might be available to DEQ over time. And these are, again, as I said, are just a few of the examples, but I wanted to highlight the fact that these are the number of states who in the last couple of years have at least tried to do something legislatively, some successfully, not successfully, but clearly there is an interest across the country to try and address environmental justice in an appropriate way and in a way that would be effective. And I wouldn't try to go into all of the different pieces of legislation because some of them were quite extensive, some of them were not so much so, but we might want to over time look at what some of these other states tried to do. In terms of federal actions, there's the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is equivalent, well, a step above the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is located in the Environmental Protection Agency. And the White House Council has been given a little bit more juice than the new JAC was given, and at this point seem to have been somewhat effective in trying to make sure that at the administrative level that there has been more attention brought to some of the concerns and a little bit more synergy across federal agencies in terms of how they are thinking about how to distribute funding, how to work collaboratively across agencies so that it's a cumulative effect instead of just a one-off situation. Then you've already heard about Justice 40, but Justice 40 has given a certain amount of impetus to a lot of what's going on. There's still a lot of discussions about what that really means in places and some fine tuning. Just last week, I believe it was the Department of Energy sent out a notice of a collaborative effort. So Justice 40 will be continuing for some time. NEPA is another place where there is some activity, as we talked about in our subcommittee meeting. NEPA is looking at the redefinition of cumulative impacts, for example, but much broader than that, the whole federal government is starting to look at how they are doing work around NEPA and what that means. And, it may have implications at some point for the state, the CEPA. So we may want to pay more attention to that to see how we can align ourselves or make recommendations to align ourselves better with what's happening at the federal level with NEPA. And then there is a new climate and economic justice screening tool that has come out of the efforts of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. There's been a lot of controversy about that tool. I don't know if you've seen much of it, but whether or not to incorporate race as one of the indicators that they use in this tool. So there's still a lot of discussion around this tool and how effective it can be with or without race. So again, everyone's talking about tools and what to include, what not to include, and how to make them the most effective that they can possibly be. Excellent. Next slide. Okay, thanks. New Jersey is probably the best example of what has been done in terms of legislative action. And I just wanted to bring attention to what they did. They actually took the effort to define what an overburdened community is. And they looked at census data, they looked at demographics and other things to create that one definition, which I think is going to be important for us to think about here in terms of what we define as an overburdened community and what data we use to identify what those overburdened communities look like. Because I think if we look more closely at census data, demographic data, socioeconomic data, and some of the things that other tools are using, we will be able as a state to better define the targeted areas that we need to be looking at and working in. Next slide. Another example is Virginia, which is next door. I wanted to take one that was a little bit further away, one next door, and you'll see the next one I've chosen. But Virginia started simply initially with defining or creating an environmental justice committee or commission. But they created this Council on Environmental Justice through an executive order, which was signed, I believe, 2 years ago now. And then they codified their definition of environmental justice community. Part of that codification came as a result of the challenges around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that was being run through a historically African-American community in Virginia. And so the legislature decided that they needed to do more because the court was very clear in their opinion about what it appeared that the state was failing to do in order to protect that particular community. So that's one of the things that we may want to consider at some point if the environment is such that that kind of thing can happen. Obviously, if it's legislative, it more or less guarantees that it's going to be easier to enforce than it is in other ways. But this is just one more example of a legislative opportunity. And then there's California, obviously, which is in a lot of ways way ahead of the curve when it comes to the kind of work that can be done to address environmental justice communities. And I decided to pull from that their definition of cumulative impact, since that's one of the things that our board is going to be, have been talking about for the last couple of months, and we'll be talking about it that much more. And I found it interesting that they defined cumulative impacts as referring to two or more individual effects, which when considered together are considerable or which compound or increase other environmental impacts. And I think that this sets a good example of what we can consider also as we talk today about the different factors that we need to consider with cumulative impacts. But again, this is a legislative mandate through the state of California legislature. And back in 2010, they did something that put them on this path with this 2010 report on cumulative impacts, and they actually looked at the scientific foundation for doing that and looked at it through a hazard assessment through their Office of Health Hazards. So I think this again sets a good example for us to consider in terms of some of the characteristics that we should consider and set for our work moving forward and for any recommendations coming from this group. Then I want to talk a little bit about non-legislative actions, and obviously those are much easier to do than legislative actions are in most cases. New Jersey, again, is on the cutting edge of a lot of this work, not too far away from us. And they did things like taking time to educate and empower communities, which we've talked a lot about. I'm not sure that a lot of states do it very well, but I think that is something that we need to do more of, because too many times we have communities that aren't empowered because they don't have the education and the understanding to know what's going on and to be able to ask the right questions or to go to the right agency to ask for answers to questions and that kind of thing. So I think this is very relevant to what we're talking about now and what we've seen and heard over at least the last year from community during public comment periods. They have established a community collaborative initiative, but this is primarily in urban areas in the state. And while New Jersey is more urban than North Carolina, I think this could be a model to use both in urban and rural areas with some tweaking. So that is something else that's non-legislative that could be an easy idea for putting into action. There was another executive order 23 out of the state of New Jersey that actually created an interagency council, which we don't have here, which would actually incorporate every agency similar to what you see at the federal level, so that there is collaboration of information, resources, training, and all of the things that could potentially help with some efficiency and some economy, as well as sharing of information, so that there is a duplication of some of the work that may be going on across the various agencies. And maybe even finding out some things that agencies are doing that another agency might be able to use that they may not be aware of. So this, I think, is another opportunity That was done through executive order and doesn't require any kind of legislative action in order to make it happen. Pennsylvania also did an executive order in 2021, and they established an Office of Environmental Justice within their Department of Environmental Protection. And that person is headed by the Director of Environmental Justice, and they are appointed to serve by the Secretary of the agency. So that is another opportunity where something like that could potentially happen and give an individual the ability to do the work in a way that could make a difference, that would give them the authority to do the work, and other people would listen to them when they speak, figuratively speaking. Maryland, which is right up the road, has done a lot of work around environmental justice. As we all know, we've had Dr. Jacoby Wilson come and talk with us on a couple of occasions. But they have incorporated EJ activities into all of their state operations very effectively. And they've done a lot of proactive engagement. They've had a commission for at least a decade now in Maryland. And so they've had a lot of time to consider, to make the mistakes and correct those mistakes and bring the engagement of the community. And I believe at this point have done a really good job of establishing some of that trust and transparency that we've been talking about we'd like to see in the work that we're doing here. And again, Maryland has worked to build networks. I had the opportunity to work with them for a while, and they've done a really good job of outreach even to businesses and other entities that we've often talked about and struggled with figuring out how to effectively work with businesses, to get businesses to understand that, to make the business case for why it's good to engage in environmental justice. And then they have their 20-member body, which is their Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, that has been doing a lot of work over the last decade to not just bring attention to the state, but to actually go out into communities and do the real on-the-ground work that needs to be done there. And then Dr. Wilson has talked about EJ screening. We talked about it a little bit today, but they've taken a lot of time to add other layers that you would not necessarily think about. For example, they've looked at parks and who goes to parks and use that as a layer. They've looked at resilience in coastal areas. They've looked at food deserts and that kind of thing, and all of those layers have been incorporated into their mapping tool so that they can really target communities for the kind of work that they would like to do over time. And based on what I know at this point, it sounds like it's been really helpful to have all of these layers, because it does help to better define what they're trying to do and to target the communities that really need the help.
They even incorporated broadband.
That's right, they've incorporated broadband as well, yes. They've done a lot of looking at socioeconomic factors as a part, so they have a lot of different layers that have been incorporated into that tool. And for this last portion, I just want to talk a little bit about what I perceive as some of the opportunities to advance EJ at DEQ. And as we know, the Secretary, under the Solid Waste Management Act, the Secretary has the authority to deny permits. However, in the 20 plus years that this act has been in place, DEQ has never denied a permit in an EJ area, which obviously is an opportunity if that were used in the way that it should be used. And I can think of a couple of examples where it could have worked very well to do that. So that's an opportunity, I think, for the future. Mr. Escott just talked about ARPA funds, but along with ARPA funds, there are other funding opportunities across DEQ that I think would be useful. Weatherization assistance, the state energy program, some of the other funding that we don't necessarily think about as directly EJ related, that if we're looking at a comprehensive program, that all of those various funding opportunities could be used in a comprehensive way to improve a community, or at least help with the condition of a community. And then we heard today a little bit more about working with federal agencies. I think that is another opportunity where we can take advantage of a lot of what is available, and even in some cases maybe touch agencies that may not have thought and go to them with opportunities for funding for all of the funds that we know are going to be available soon across the federal government. And the third issue I thought would be one that revolves around public participation in health protection. Just recently, Department of Health and Human Services got additional money for their dashboard, and that I think presents an opportunity for DEQ and DHHS to work more collaboratively together so that that health data and DHHS can become a part of the mapping tool that DEQ currently has, which would provide another enhancement to that tool. In addition to that, increased monitoring would be very important in some parts of the state, especially in problem areas, and then doing that on a regular basis and then analyzing that data so that that data could be incorporated into a tool as well, which would help to further target specific areas that are particularly problematic within the state. If those actions are taken, I believe that over time that we could see a great deal of improvement for EJ communities across the state. I think it would also help with improving the relationship between EJ communities and DEQ. Transparency is extremely important, and all of these things would add to the transparency that DEQ would have with community. There are a couple of things that have been added as a result of some of the recommendations from the board, such as extending the time for comment periods, or at least incorporating or allowing public comment periods when there may not have been one, so that the community at least has an opportunity to participate in the process in a meaningful way. And if there is no requirement to have a public comment period or to have a public hearing, to take that opportunity to do that so that there is transparency across the agency. And all of these ideas sort of intersect to create that quilt that will make all things work better within the agency and outside of the agency across state government. And I hope that over time we can see some of those things start happening. And when we submit the recommendations for cumulative impacts, I hope that will be taken seriously, because those are some of the gaps that we have in comparison to what some of the other states are doing at this point. And I hope I didn't talk too fast, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Questions, comments, right ways. Very helpful. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Sherry. That was really great. And we will all benefit from this. I was a little concerned because I don't know, but you mentioned that the climate and economic justice screening tool that came out of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, that there was some controversy over whether race should be. Can you say more about that?
Sure. It's actually was developed at CEQ, at the Council on Environmental Quality, and originally race was included as a factor, but it has been removed because of, I believe, some legal concerns as well as some other concerns with some challenges right now. So I know that there was a comment period, and there have been extensive comments that are requesting that race be included as one of the factors in that tool. But I don't believe it's been added at this point, and it was in a beta testing process. So I will do some more checking and see if what may happen with that, but that last I talked with someone, it didn't appear that race would be incorporated into that too.
Carrie?
During your presentation, Sherry, you mentioned a lot of really helpful items. One that stood out to me was the New Jersey item with the EJ Interagency Council.
Mhm.
And it made me think, you know, I'm not too familiar with it, but we do have something here in North Carolina. The cabinet agencies recently have an environmental justice and equity lead per every cabinet agency. So that could be a good resource as well. But it just made me think of that because I'm thinking, you know, what are some of the things we already have? Can we connect with those folks and see what's going on there? But we do have that, so we can use that as a resource.
Sure, and I think that's a good start. But the Interagency Council, at least the way it was formatted in other places, including the federal government, had two positions. One was a senior level person and one was a staff level person. And I believe with the liaison, some of them are senior level, but some of them are more staff level. And the reason for the two levels of participation was that if it was something that needed or required a decision, that senior level person could make that decision, whereas a staff person would not have that authority, which may slow down various processes.
Understood. That's a good point. And I'm not too familiar with it, but still we can look
Yeah.
into that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Sounds good. It was very helpful. I appreciate the overview.
Other comments, questions, feedback for?
Carolina, just to follow up on what you just said, and actually thank you for bringing that up, 'cause that is important too. With the way the structure is, who is over each person? Who is the person that's over that?
Well, I don't know the person that's over the whole thing, but for example, for us, our EJ point of contact for this is Ms. Sharon Martin,
No.
our deputy secretary.
Yeah, but I mean, is there a time when each agency person gets together? Seems to me like this is a group, so who is over the group? Or is there anyone?
Gotcha. I can find that out. I'll have to, I'll do a little research on my end and find that out and present that to you all. But I do know that they do have meetings. I'm not sure, you know, the latest update from those meetings, but I can connect with folks and get a response for this team here and see how that may be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be good. Thank
Put it on my to-do.
It actually came out of Executive Order 246, and it directed that each agency name an EJ liaison. But there wasn't a requirement that it necessarily be a senior level person. So in some agencies, it's a senior level person. In other agencies, it's more like a staff person.
Yeah, I recall that, but I'm just thinking of who puts this together. Say, for example,
It's the governor's office that's in charge
It
of
is.
that, yeah.
Yes,
so the governor, okay, thank you.
Other comments, questions?
So it would be good also to know when we can get some results from that. I know it just started, you know, but it would be good to see how it's moving.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got it on my to-do for us, don't worry.
And I do recall that there is some training that was instituted, and so it'll take a while, but it would still be nice to know at least by our next meeting, you know, what's going on there. in progress.
I got you.
Terrific. Great, thank you again, Sherry, for the presentation. Our last item on today's agenda is a follow-up conversation from our last meeting about environmental justice and economic development. Secretary Advisor addressed this issue in her introductory remarks today. We've heard several people talk about and how to start thinking about environmental justice earlier in the economic development process, as well as the gaps we still have. So let's talk a bit more today about that and the role of how do we improve and make sure environmental justice is a consideration locational decisions, and this state being the #1 state in the country for business recruitment, that's a good thing. And so how do we leverage that in a way to make sure that environmental justice considerations are part and parcel, let me say core, to those decision-making processes? Any thoughts building on what we've already heard from the Secretary and what various presenters have had to say today about the role of environmental justice in business recruitment and the economic development in our state? Yes, Carlos.
You had mentioned that there's quite a few people that have been moving into the state because of the virus and so forth. And we've been reading lately about, the last few days, about the amount of busloads of people that are being brought up from the border and distributed in DC, and will be leaving from there. And we have to be really aware of what changes are. We always seem to say it's just, the color, that makes this difference. But it isn't. These people come up with different customs, different foods, and different things we have to be well aware of in order to facilitate, a happy home per se. So North Carolina is in a very advantageous area. We are getting a lot of people, but it gives us a lot of opportunity to educate ourselves in other cultures and so forth. And I really feel it's one of the things, especially now with climate change, because we've faced, needless to say, a lot of changes within the last few years, that people are becoming more and more of climate change.
Right.
And then we have to have more answers for them with the conditions that are existing right now and with the facilities that we have to do it with.
Precisely, absolutely. Other comments, thoughts on the economic development side? What can we do? Aaron?
Yeah, I just have a comment. I think it's great when we hear that North Carolina is the #1 state for economic development. But those of us who sit on this committee and others in the state are really concerned about how this impacts the health of American citizens. And so I just think we need to spend more time in looking at that and making sure that we don't consider profit more than people.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I go back to the presentation from the Department of Commerce and the questions that were raised about transparency. I think in order for us to move forward, there needs to be some transparency. A community shouldn't learn after an incentive has been given and a permit given or in serious consideration that there is a polluting industry coming to their community and they have no other option except to, just throw their hands up and say, okay. There needs to be some way similar to what one of the states I talked about is doing, that requires a business to go in advance and have that conversation with the community and make them aware that they are considering that community, so that there is some transparency. There is no transparency in this process now, and we've heard it over and over and over again from communities.
Other comments? I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the equity, conversations around the state about how do we achieve greater shared prosperity out of being rated the #1 state in the nation in terms of business recruitment and the like. So for me, I think, I said it earlier today, I think in all of these decisions, when we talk about equity, we talk mostly about equity on the demand side, and that's important. We have residents of this state who are suffering disproportionately because of past policy processes, procedures like transparency and all of that. I think the other side of equity, though, is on the supply side. And we got tons of money coming into this state to solve and address equity on the demand side. How do we ensure on the supply side that the very people who are being devastated on the demand side get some of the shared prosperity on the supply side to solve the problems? And I think that we have to be conscious, we have to be intentional, we have to be purposeful about making sure that there is equitable access to the resources to do the work, whether it be the supply chain for disaster recovery, whether it be the supply chain for the new companies coming to the state. How do we do procurement forecast and contracting forecast that says in billions of dollars are available for these areas of businesses, and then how do we connect people, including people in these communities, with those opportunities? Right now, none of that is happening, or very little of it is happening in an intentional and purposeful way. And so I would just say we need a balanced view of equity. It's very, very important. I'm not minimizing the demand side because, as I said, we do have people, but how do you ever get people on the demand side who need things out of the situation they're in? It's called a good job, a viable business, or something of that nature, so that they won't be in that situation in the past. So I think there's a window of opportunity here. I don't think money is the issue. I think how we use it and how we approach things is the real issue. And I think in an economic development way, I think we need to focus on those issues. And I think we need to engage these county level economic development offices in the process, because it's not just at the state level, it's at that level as well, that when you're recruiting, in fact, I think it's going to be a competitive advantage moving forward when you say to a company, we have this supply chain of businesses who can do these jobs, this work, given you're coming to our state. Otherwise, we run the risk of investing in rebuilding infrastructure in communities, and folks from outside the state come in, and those communities get, the very people that we care about get pushed out of those places. And so I think that having that conversation and putting into place systems to make sure that there is local benefit and gain on the supply side. Because if we don't do that, we will widen inequality, not narrow it. I think that's been always been my concern, and I think that we need to have more of those discussions. And I know the Secretary's been working on this in DEQ about how we do this, but I think that's a conversation that all those equity officers in the agencies that we ought to be having with them to make sure that on every agency that this is a priority. And I think we need to be having those conversations with these communities that we're bringing these facilities to. And that needs to be a selling point up front if we're serious about equity and inclusion. I think that that's a crucial distinction that I don't see enough attention being devoted to.
And especially, I just want to add, especially if they're receiving grants and public funds,
yeah, absolutely.
it should be
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Other? Yes.
So Veronica has said that she agrees with the comment on transparency, but also participation in the process. The federal government definition for EJ involves public participation and agreement in the process. Speaking for 2 to 3 minutes in public comments or sending in comments that may or may not be incorporated into the final decision-making process is not enough. The safety of the public should be the chief concern of government at all levels.
Other thoughts, other comment, feedback? Something's wrong. This group is a loss for words. If there are no other comments or feedback on the Jeff.
No, Veronica put laughing faces up on the
Oh,
screen.
yeah, that's true. I think we're at the end of our discussion of agenda items. Two things. One, I need to entertain a motion to adjourn the formal meeting. Oh, that's right. You had an issue. I'm sorry.
I hope I'm in order of bringing this issue up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot.
But board members received a request from the impacted communities against wood pellets to hold us. Actually, they were hoping that they could have something at this meeting. And of course, it was too late when they asked. And so they're asking if we could have a special session. I am requesting that we consider that. If we can't do a special session, we can have it on the agenda for the next meeting. Of course, it is an urgent issue that's concerning expansion of the wood pellet industry in North Carolina. So, as I said, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I'm out of order bringing this up, nor do I know if there's any decision we can make on this at this time in terms of how we can best support this request.
We're going to have to hold the entire group because not enough people are here today for that. Why don't you and I take responsibility for polling the board and coming back with a recommendation for what we do? Why don't we do that right away? Does that work?
Yes.
Yes. Everybody's comfortable with that? Okay, now, my adjournment, I need a motion. Okay, just adjourn?
Yeah, you can tell us what to do.
Yeah, you just want to do. Go drink some whiskey and come back at 5 o'clock. We're going to adjourn now and then take a break until 5 p.m. and we'll come back for our public comment. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate it. I think this was a really productive session. So thank you. Okay, I'd like to call us back together. Welcome back, everyone. We will now transition to the public comment segment of our meeting. Ms. Kramer will announce the name or names of people who have requested to speak. Everyone will have 3 minutes for their comments. And Ms. Kramer, you're on.
Thank you, Chairman. Today we only have one person who has signed up for a comment, and that is Kathy Buckley.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Johnson, committee members. First, I want to thank you for your serious, inspiring efforts to do something about very urgent matters, even life and death matters. I appreciate your efforts very much. Thank you. And second, I spoke to Renee about the possibility of people who are not here in person to possibly testify on WebEx. And I know most people don't live within a mile of Raleigh. Most North Carolinians. So I was hoping that to save them money and fuel and greenhouse gases, that if there's any way that they could actually be allowed to testify, that would be good. And third, I want to support the possibility that you really take action on the wood pellet facility in Ahoskie. It's really a trifecta disaster. You know, at the local level, it's going to be increasing wood dust pollution and noise and all sorts of nasty things for folks who live nearby. At the regional level, you know, the area that it's going to be covering, you know, they'll be taking trees down within 75 miles of that, you know, of that plant, and it's going to be, it's going to make, you know, the 16,000 acres they take down a year, it's going to make flooding even worse when the next hurricane comes. And at the worldwide level, it's a fake solution. You know, wood pellets actually put out more carbon than coal. And North Carolina is subsidizing the export of these things. You know, Secretary Beiser talked about, you know, some of the things that North Carolina is #1 in that are good, but North Carolina is the #1 exporter of wood pellets in the country. And you know, the August 16th hearing is critical. You know, please do whatever you can to act as a committee and also as individuals, if you could, you know, attend the hearing or get other folks to attend and to get comments in by August 19th. I don't know how long we're going to be able to get away with fake solutions. You know, we're not fooling Mother Nature, and hopefully we'll wake up and do something. It's crazy that North Carolina taxpayers are actually helping to make their situation even worse. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Chairman, that's the only person who signed up for public comment. So
If there is anyone else would like to comment, the floor is now open. Hearing none, we'll close the floor. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you. Dr. Thompson and I will act upon the recommendation on the table, poll the entire board, and get back to everyone with an email as quickly as possible here, the latest by tomorrow, and we'll go from there. Thank you all for making the effort to be here today, and thank you all, those of you who called in who couldn't make it to the meeting today. We appreciate you. Be safe, everyone. And thank you for everyone who, and the lady who gave us public comment. We appreciate you coming as well. Be safe, everyone.